They laughed at her old boots, but the laughter was quiet, the way of soldiers who mock a thing to test the edges of its power. The boots were the first thing anyone noticed about Master Sergeant Alara Vance. When the C-130's ramp lowered onto the gravel of forward operating base Kestrel, spitting her into the teeth of a high-altitude Hindu Kush wind, the boots seemed to precede her. They were standard-issue leather, but where others were polished to a mirror shine or at least uniformly scuffed, hers were a cartography of abuse. The toes were worn to a pale, suede-like texture, the stitching on the welt was frayed, and the leather over the right ankle bore a dark, matte stain the size of a man's palm, a patch that refused to hold a shine, as if the hide itself had been fundamentally changed. A pair of young privates, barely old enough to grow the patchy beards they were cultivating, exchanged a glance. One nudged the other, a smirk ghosting across his lips. "Logistics must be scraping the bottom of the barrel," he muttered, just loud enough to be carried on the wind. Alara heard them. She heard everything. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept over the base once, a calm, comprehensive scan that took in the placement of the HESCO barriers, the sight lines from the watchtowers, the lazy sag in a section of concertina wire, and the faces of the men watching her. She was a woman in her late 40s, her face a network of fine lines etched by sun and stress, her braid of iron-gray hair tucked severe and tight. She carried a single duffel bag and a presence that was utterly still. Corporal Kenji Tanaka, a comms specialist with observant eyes, didn't laugh. He saw the way she moved, an economy of motion that spoke of zero wasted energy. He saw the way her gaze wasn't just looking but assessing. And he saw the boots not as a sign of neglect, but as evidence of a long, hard road. Her orders assigned her to the S4 shop. Logistics. She was to manage inventory in the sprawling, dust-choked Chronicles containers that held the base's lifeblood. Beans, bullets, and bandages. It was a job for a junior NCO, not a master sergeant with 25 years of service. It was a deliberate slight, a bureaucratic shunting to the sidelines. The supply clerk, a sergeant half her age, pointed her toward a stack of manifests. "Just need you to cross-reference these with the container contents, Master Sergeant. Make sure the numbers match the paper." "Understood," Alara said. Her voice was low and even devoid of resentment. She dropped her duffel by the door of a Chronicles marked Medical Overstock and picked up the clipboard. As the metal door groaned shut behind her, the laughter outside became a little bolder, a brief, shared joke about the old woman and her ancient boots. Inside the cool darkness of the container, Alara took a slow breath, the scent of antiseptic and canvas filling her lungs. The laughter didn't matter. The job didn't matter. She was here. That was all that mattered. The first manifest was for Celine's solution. She began to count. Colonel Marcus Thorne liked his world orderly. His uniform was perfectly pressed, the creases sharp enough to cut. His office was a sanctuary of control amidst the chaos of FOB Kestrel. The maps on his wall precisely aligned, the papers on his desk stacked in neat right-angled towers. When Master Sergeant Vance was shown in, he felt an immediate, visceral annoyance. She stood before his desk, perfectly at ease, her hands clasped loosely behind her back. But her presence, her very appearance, was a disruption to his order. It was her boots. They sat on his clean floor like a pair of muddy strays in a pristine showroom. "Master Sergeant Vance," he began, his tone clipped. He tapped a finger on her personnel file, a file so thin it was almost insulting. Most of it was redacted, black lines guarding her history like sentinels. "Your transfer was unexpected. Command just dropped you on my roster with a note saying, 'For logistical support.'" "Yes, sir," Alara said. Thorne leaned back, steepling his fingers. He was a man who believed in trajectories, in career paths that made sense on paper. Hers did not. "You've been in 25 years. A master sergeant with your time in service is usually winding down stateside, maybe training recruits, not humping boxes on a forward base. You're a bit long in the tooth for this environment, wouldn't you say?" The command felt I was suited for the deployment. Sir, her face was impassive, a calm sea. It gave him nothing to work with, and that irritated him further. His eyes dropped pointedly to her feet. And those boots. I run a tight ship, Sergeant. Uniformity, discipline, presentation. It matters. It's a reflection of our readiness. Your footwear looks like it was pulled from a battlefield grave. Is regulation merely a suggestion to you? For the first time, a flicker of something moved in Alara's eyes, a deep, ancient cold. They are serviceable, Colonel. They've been with me a long time. Get a new pair issued, he ordered, a sharp, dismissive wave of his hand. I want my NCOs to look like NCOs, not relics. He looked back at her file, at the black bars of ink. The redactions were deep, covering entire sections labeled Operational History, and special assignments. All that remained were basic training dates and promotions, a skeleton with no meat. It made him suspicious. Was she a screw-up? Someone being hidden away in the middle of nowhere until she could retire. Your duties are in the supply yard, he said, his voice hardening. You will manage inventory. You will count containers. You will stay in your lane and out of my operations. Is that clear? Crystal, sir, she replied, the word perfectly formed, perfectly neutral. Dismissed. As she turned and walked out, Thorne watched her go. He felt the distinct and unsettling impression that he had just been measured, weighed, and found wanting. The quiet, unassuming woman in the worn-out boots had a spine of pure steel, and for some reason, that felt less like an asset and more like a threat to the tidy, predictable world he had built around himself. He made a mental note to have the S1 run another background check. There had to be something in her file, something to explain the woman who didn't fit. He hated things that didn't fit. Alara didn't just count boxes. The Chronicles yard became her observation post, the monotonous task of inventory a cover for a far more critical assessment. For 3 days, she moved with a quiet, unhurried rhythm, her clipboard in hand, her eyes missing nothing. The work was mindless, which freed her mind for other things. She learned the pulse of FOB Kestrel. She noted that the morning shift change for the perimeter guards was sloppy. For a full 3 minutes between 5:58 and 6:01, the western perimeter section gamma was observed only by a single thermal camera with a known flicker. She saw how the supply convoys arrived and departed, kicking up predictable dust clouds that offered 2 minutes of visual cover for anyone moving along the southern berm. She mapped the blind spots from the watchtowers, calculating the dead zones created by the undulating terrain and the base's own infrastructure. The eastern tower, Post 3, had a commanding view of the valley, but a cluster of rock spires 800 meters out created a shadow large enough to hide a fire team. Her hands would be tallying crates of MREs, but her mind was elsewhere. She listened to the radio chatter, filtering the mundane logistics requests from the tactical traffic, building a mental map of patrol routes, call signs, and operational tempos. She observed the people. She saw the bravado of the young privates, the weary competence of the junior NCOs, the bottled-up stress in the officers jogging endless laps around the base perimeter. In the motor pool, she met Master Sergeant Samuel Sam Jones, a man whose face was a roadmap of grease stains and desert sun. He was the chief mechanic, a grizzled veteran who moved with the slow, deliberate certainty of a man who understood engines better than people. He saw her walk up, his eyes immediately falling to her boots. But he didn't smirk. His gaze was appraising, respectful. Seen a lot of miles, those boots, he said, his voice a low rumble like an idling engine. He wiped his hands on an already filthy rag. They've earned their keep, Alara replied, stopping by a Humvee with its hood up. Most kids these days, they want new gear right out of the box. Think shiny means effective, Sam grunted, pulling a wrench from his pocket. They don't get it. The old gear, the stuff that's seen you through. It's got a soul. He looked from her boots to her eyes. What can I do for you, Master Sergeant? Just looking, checking the state of your generators, she said, her official excuse. They run, he said, but the secondary fuel line for the backup Jenny is routed too close to the main. One lucky shot could take out both. Been telling the lieutenant for months. Paperwork's probably sitting on his desk. Alara nodded slowly. Another vulnerability. Critical one. Good to know, Sergeant. She left the motor pool and walked to the edge of the base, near the sagging concertina wire she'd noticed on her first day. She stood there for a long time, looking not at the wire, but past it, up at the jagged peaks that clawed at the sky. The mountains were impassive, ancient, and deadly. They held secrets. They didn't care about regulations or shiny boots. They only respected strength, silence, and survival. Alara felt a strange sense of kinship with them. She understood their language. She knew the wind that was coming. The pressure arrived not with a bang, but with a whisper of grit against metal. The sky, a brilliant, depthless blue only moments before, began to pale, then yellow. The wind, a constant presence in the mountains, picked up a new voice, a low, mournful howl that grew in pitch and intensity. Ashamel, the dreaded desert windstorm. Within minutes, FOB Kestrel was engulfed. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. A thick, choking cloud of sand and dust blotted out the sun, plunging the base into an eerie twilight. The world became a maelstrom of noise and stinging particles. Men hurried for cover, pulling goggles down, wrapping shamas over their faces. The base, once a hub of activity, became a ghost town of huddled shapes and muffled shouts. Inside the Tactical Operations Center, the CIC, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Colonel Thorne stood before the main communications console, his face a tight mask of frustration. The screens, usually alive with satellite imagery, drone feeds, and blinking icons representing friendly forces, were now a mess of digital snow and error messages. Status on Viper 2. Thorne snapped, his voice cutting through the din. Corporal Tanaka, his headset pressed tight against his ear, shook his head. Nothing, sir. I've lost them. The storm is playing hell with the satellite link. I'm getting nothing but static across all channels. Primary, secondary, burst transmission, all gone. A cold dread settled in the room. Viper 2 was a 6-man long-range reconnaissance patrol, deep in a sector of the mountains nicknamed the Talon's Maw, a labyrinth of narrow canyons and hostile villages. They were already outside of reliable radio range, depending on satellite uplinks to check in. Now they were cut off, blind and deaf. Try the backup array, Thorne ordered. Already did, sir. The comms officer replied, his voice strained. It's no better. The signal degradation is over 90%. Thorne slammed his hand on the console. He was a man losing control, and he hated it. His neat, orderly world was being torn apart by a force of nature, and his men were caught in it. The protocol was to wait for the storm to pass. But Viper 2 was on a time-sensitive mission, and every minute of silence increased the odds they had run into trouble. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of the room's discipline. Alara was there. She had been on her way to deliver a new set of printer cartridges to the CIC when the storm hit. Now she stood just inside the doorway, a still, silent figure amidst the controlled chaos. She hadn't been invited in, but no one had told her to leave. They had forgotten she was there. But she was listening. She heard the frantic reports, saw the failing screens, and understood the problem on a level they couldn't. It wasn't just the storm. It was the system. The main comms array was powerful but exposed. The backup, as Sam Jones had inadvertently confirmed, was vulnerable. And they had no tertiary plan. She watched Thorne pace, his commands growing sharper, more desperate. She watched Tanaka fruitlessly cycle through frequencies. And she made a decision. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't announce her intentions. To do so would have invited an argument, a dismissal from Thorne that she didn't have time for. Action was the only language that would be understood now. Alara slipped back out of the CIC, melting into the blinding, roaring storm as if she were a part of it. The wind tore at her, a physical force that tried to push her back. She leaned into it, her old boots finding purchase on the shifting gravel. She moved with a purpose that defied the chaos, her internal map of the base as clear as any GPS. She wasn't heading for the main comms array. That was a fool's errand. Instead, she made a sharp turn behind the mess hall, heading for the row of supply sheds near the motor pool. From one of her logistics containers, the one marked Signal Core Obsolete, she grabbed a small toolkit and a spool of shielded coaxial cable. She knew this container's contents by heart. She had spent a day organizing it. Then she went to the motor pool, where Sam Jones was securing a flapping sheet of metal. He saw her coming, a ghost in the storm. "The generators?" he yelled over the wind. "The old relay," she yelled back, pointing toward a small, forgotten comms dish mounted on the side of a supply shed. It was a line-of-sight relay, decommissioned years ago but never removed. "It's on a separate power circuit from the main grid." Sam's eyes widened in understanding. He just nodded, turning to grab a heavy wrench. He knew what she was doing. He would run interference if anyone came asking. Alara braced herself against the shed's wall, the wind trying to rip the toolkit from her hands. She wrenched open the relay's rusted maintenance panel. Inside was a bird's nest of old wires. Her fingers, nimble and sure despite the cold and the stinging sand, went to work. This wasn't a by-the-book repair. It was battlefield engineering, a form of mechanical blasphemy. She bypassed the dead transmitter, her wire strippers moving with surgical precision. She spliced the new coaxial cable directly into the dish's waveguide, turning the entire apparatus into a crude but powerful directional antenna. It wouldn't reach a satellite. It didn't need to. She wasn't aiming for the sky. She was aiming for the mountains. She knew the patrol's last known heading. She knew the topography. She knew that radio waves could be bounced off certain rock faces. It was a long shot, a 1 in a million chance. She physically manhandled the heavy dish, grunting with effort, aiming it not at Viper 2's location, but at a massive, sheer cliff face miles away that would, if she was right, act as a passive reflector. Back in the CIC, Tanaka was about to give up when a flicker appeared on a dusty, forgotten secondary monitor, one usually used for diagnostics. A single, wavering green line, a carrier wave. "Sir," he whispered, his voice full of disbelief. "I've got something." He jammed his headphones on, cranking the gain. Through a hurricane of static, a voice, faint and broken, bled through. "Kestrel, this is Viper 2, repeat. Can anyone read? We are pinned." The voice faded, but it was enough. They were alive. Colonel Thorne stared at the screen, then at Tanaka, his mouth agape. "Where is that signal coming from? What did you do?" Tanaka shook his head, baffled. "I don't know, sir. It's not coming from our arrays. It's coming from nowhere." Just then, the door to the CIC opened, and Alara Vance stepped back inside, shaking dust from her shoulders. She placed the used printer cartridges on a desk. "Your delivery, sir," she said quietly, as if she had been gone only a minute. Thorne's eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, the dismissive annoyance in his gaze was replaced by something else entirely. A deep, unnerving confusion. The immediate aftermath of the signal's acquisition was a mixture of relief and bafflement. The connection was unstable, a flickering ghost, but Tanaka, guided by the phantom signal, was able to re-establish a fragile data link through the main satellite once the storm's fury abated slightly. They now had Viper 2's location, but the mystery of the signal's origin lingered in the CIC. The comms officer, a young lieutenant, approached Alara where she stood by the door. He had a look of awe on his face. "Master Sergeant, that signal. It came from a defunct relay dish by the motor pool. The system logs show it hasn't been active in 5 years. How did you?" Alara looked at him, her expression unreadable. The wind must have knocked something back into place. "Lucky break." She delivered the line with such bland conviction that it was almost believable. It was a simple technical lie, a deflection that offered a plausible, if improbable, explanation. It closed the door on further questions, leaving them with an answer that required no understanding of her true capabilities. Colonel Thorne overheard the exchange. He didn't believe it for a second. Lucky break? The wind? No. He looked at Vance, at her calm demeanor, her dusty uniform, and the pieces began to click together in a way he didn't like. She hadn't been delivering cartridges. She had been out in that storm. She had done something. She had single-handedly solved a problem his entire command staff couldn't, and then she had lied about it with the ease of a seasoned operative. The laughter about her boots was gone now. The whispers that followed her as she walked back to the S4 yard were of a different kind. They were questioning, curious, tinged with a new respect. "Did you see her? Walked right out of the storm like it was nothing." Tanaka said the signal came from the boneyard. "Who is she?" The soldiers who had mocked her now watched her with a wary apprehension. They sensed they had misjudged something fundamental. Corporal Tanaka was the most affected. He saw her not as a relic, but as an enigma. He replayed the moment in his mind. The chaos, the panic, her quiet exit, and her silent return followed by the miraculous signal. He understood she was the source, the quiet eye of the hurricane. He watched her resume her inventory count as if nothing had happened, her movements just as deliberate, just as economical as before. She didn't seek praise or acknowledgement. Her stillness was her power. Back in his office, Thorne pulled up her file again, staring at the redacted lines as if he could burn through them with the force of his will. The thin file was no longer a sign of a failed career. It was a fortress, deliberately constructed to hide the truth. He had dismissed her as a relic, a piece of old, worn-out equipment. He was beginning to understand that some old equipment is kept not because it is obsolete, but because it is dangerously effective. His initial dismissal had curdled into a potent mix of suspicion and grudging curiosity. Master Sergeant Alara Vance was not in his way. She was a ghost in his machine, and he had no idea what she was capable of. The fragile comms link with Viper 2 had given them a location, but the news was grim. The patrol was pinned down in a narrow box canyon. What the locals called the Goat's Jaw, an insurgent force had them trapped, controlling the high ground around the canyon's only entrance. One of the patrol members, a corporal, had taken a round to the leg and was losing blood. Extraction was critical and needed to happen before sunrise. Thorne convened an emergency briefing in the CIC. The room was tense, the adrenaline from the storm replaced by the cold calculus of combat. On the main screen, a satellite image showed the terrain. The Goat's Jaw was a death trap. "All right, here's the plan," Thorne announced, his voice regaining its customary authority. He pointed a laser at the map. "We'll send a QRF, 2 MRAPs, and a light armored vehicle straight up this wadi. Air support from the Apaches will suppress the ridges here and here. We go in hard and fast. Overwhelm them with firepower. Grab our guys and get out." It was a textbook plan. A plan built on overwhelming force. It was also, Alara knew, suicidal. The wadi was a perfect kill zone, a channel that would funnel the vehicles directly into a pre-sighted ambush. The insurgents held the high ground. They could rain down RPGs and machine gun fire before the Apaches could even get on station. Alara was in the back of the room. She had been summoned to provide logistical data for the quick reaction force, fuel consumption, ammunition loads, medical supply requirements. She was meant to be a living calculator, not a strategist. She remained silent, her arms crossed, her face a stone mask. Thorne finished his briefing. "Questions?" The room was silent. The plan was aggressive, but it was the colonel's plan. No one dared challenge it. But Thorne's eyes, as if drawn by a magnet, found Alara in the back. Her silence was louder than any objection. He remembered the relay dish, the lie, the impossible signal. A part of him wanted to reassert his authority, to put her back in her box. Another, more pragmatic part was intrigued. He made a decision. "Master Sergeant Vance," he said, the entire room turning to look at her. "You've been quiet. The S4 shop have any thoughts on the tactical situation?" The question was laced with sarcasm, a public challenge. Alara didn't flinch. She took a step forward, her worn boots making no sound on the concrete floor. "Yes, sir." Her voice was calm but carried to every corner of the room. She pointed not at the laser dot, but at the terrain surrounding it. "Your approach uses the kill zone as a staging area, sir. The insurgents are expecting a frontal assault up that wadi. They've had hours to sight their weapons. You'll lose the first vehicle before it's halfway to the canyon mouth. The Apaches will be suppressing empty rocks, while the real positions pick your force apart. A stunned silence fell over the room. A master sergeant from logistics had just publicly dismantled the colonel's plan. Thorne's face tightened, a muscle twitching in his jaw. And your brilliant alternative, Sergeant. Alara's gaze was steady. She moved to the map. Not brilliant, sir. Just quieter. Her finger traced a faint, almost invisible line on the topographical overlay, high above the canyon. This is a goat path. It's not on most maps. It leads to the ridge directly overlooking the canyon from the rear. They'll have their security focused on the entrance, not on their backs. A small team, 4 or 5 operators, can use that path to infiltrate after dark. Silent approach. Neutralize the overwatch positions. Create a window for medevac. The helicopter can come in low and fast from the north, using the canyon walls as cover. No firefight until we initiate it. On our terms. It was a classic special operations plan. High risk, high skill, relying on stealth and surprise rather than brute force. It was also the only plan that had a real chance of getting all of Viper 2 out alive. The room was thick with unspoken tension. Thorne stared at the map, then at Alara. He was on the horns of a dilemma. His plan was doctrine. Her plan was better. To accept it was to admit his own failure in front of his entire command staff. To reject it could mean sending men to their deaths. He looked into her calm, unblinking eyes. He saw no ego, no triumph, only a quiet certainty. He made his choice. Fine, he said, his voice tight. You seem to have it all figured out. You lead it. It was both a concession and a final, brutal test. You and a volunteer team. Your plan, your risk. Get it done, Vance. Night fell like a black shroud over the Hindu Kush. The wind had died, leaving behind a profound, listening silence. Alara stood with her small team near the perimeter. Corporal Tanaka, who had volunteered before Thorne even finished his sentence. Master Sergeant Sam Jones, who simply appeared with a rifle and a grim nod, his loyalty unspoken but absolute, and 2 quiet, seasoned rangers who recognized a good plan when they heard one. Alara wasn't wearing a helmet, just a simple beanie. She moved through the pre-mission checks with a fluid grace, her hands inspecting weapons and equipment, her voice a low murmur as she gave her final instructions. There was no grand speech, just clear, concise orders. Move silent. No transmissions unless it's life or limb. We are ghosts. Act like it. The infiltration was a masterclass in stealth. Alara led them out through the gap in the concertina wire she had identified days earlier. She moved not like a soldier, but like an animal born to the terrain. Her old boots, so derided in the daylight, were utterly silent on the rock, their worn soles gripping the treacherous surface. She used the shadows cast by the moonlight, flowing from one pool of darkness to the next. The others followed her lead, mimicking her movements, their respect for her growing with every silent footstep. They reached the goat path. It was less a path and more a suggestion of one, a barely there ledge on a near-vertical cliff face. Alara moved up it without hesitation, her balance supernatural. After a grueling 2-hour climb, they were in position, high above the goat's jaw. Below, they could see the faint glow of the insurgents' cigarettes, 2 machine gun nests and a handful of riflemen, all focused intently on the canyon's mouth, waiting for the noisy assault that would never come. The takedown was swift and brutal. Alara and the Rangers moved like wraiths, their knives and suppressed pistols making only soft, wet thuds in the night. It was over in 30 seconds. The overwatch was eliminated. Alara gave the signal. The medevac helicopter, which had been holding in a hidden valley miles away, began its approach. As the team descended into the canyon, they found Viper 2 huddled behind a rock formation, the wounded corporal pale and shivering. That's when the plan went sideways. A runner, sent from a nearby village, stumbled upon the scene. He let out a sharp yell before Sam Jones could drop him. The alarm was raised. From the darkness, muzzle flashes erupted. The insurgents were disorganized, but they were attacking. It was close-quarters chaos. Tanaka, providing cover fire, didn't see an insurgent flanking him from the right. The man raised his rifle, the muzzle a dark O aimed at the young corporal's head. Time seemed to slow for Alara. She was 20 feet away, engaged with another fighter. There was no time to aim, no time to shout a warning. She moved. It was a blur of pure, violent economy. She disengaged from her opponent with a disabling strike to his knee, and in a single, fluid motion, she closed the distance to Tanaka's attacker. It wasn't a standard takedown taught in any army field manual. She didn't use her rifle. Her left hand shot out, grabbing the man's head, yanking it back to expose his throat. Her right hand, holding her knife in a reverse grip, came up in a devastatingly precise arc. The blade entered and exited in a fraction of a second. The insurgent dropped without a sound, his rifle clattering on the rocks. The leader of Viper II, a young lieutenant named Harris, saw the whole thing. His eyes, wide with shock and adrenaline, fixed on Alara. His mouth opened and closed. I've only seen that in a classified training film, he stammered. His voice barely a whisper over the sound of the approaching helicopter. The CQC sequence, Project Nightfall. Only they were authorized to use it. The Wraiths. The name hung in the night air, heavy and absolute. Wraith. Alara met his gaze, her face hard in the moonlight. She put a single finger to her lips, a gesture that was both a command for silence and a plea. Then she turned her attention to the wounded corporal, her focus instantly shifting back to the mission. The extraction was a frantic, desperate affair under fire, but they made it. Aboard the shuddering helicopter, as it climbed away from the canyon, Lieutenant Harris, delirious from stress and exhaustion, started talking, his words tumbling out. They said the last one, the last Wraith. She walked out of Zarankalai alone. She carried Director Cassine's body for 3 days through enemy territory. They said the blood, his blood. It soaked right through her uniform, all the way to her boots. In the dim red light of the cabin, every eye turned, as if pulled by a string, down to Alara Vance's feet, to her old, worn boots, and to the dark, matte stain over the right ankle, a stain that no amount of polish or time could ever erase. It wasn't oil. It wasn't grime. It was blood. The return to FOB Kestrel was met not with celebration, but with a spreading, awestruck silence. The rescued members of Viper II were rushed to the medical tent, but the story of the rescue, and the name whispered by Lieutenant Harris, moved faster than any stretcher. Wraith. The name passed from soldier to soldier, a piece of forbidden lore suddenly made real. It explained everything. The redacted file, the impossible skill, the quiet authority that had nothing to do with rank. It recontextualized the woman they had dismissed. Colonel Thorne received the after-action report in his office. He read about the silent infiltration, the surgical elimination of the Overwatch, and the brutally efficient CQC. He read the transcript of Harris's debrief, the words Project Nightfall and Wraith practically glowing on the page. He felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Project Nightfall was a ghost story, a myth whispered about in intelligence circles. A deniable operations unit tasked with hunting high-value targets in the war's darkest corners. They were officially a myth, a program that never existed. And he had sent one of them to count ration packs. He had insulted her boots. The next morning, a Black Hawk helicopter landed on the base without prior announcement, its rotors kicking up a storm of dust and gravel. The door slid open and out stepped a man who needed no introduction. General Madson, the 2-star commander for the entire region. He was a legendary figure himself, a former Tier 1 operator from a different era, known for his sharp eyes and his intolerance for bureaucracy. Thorne rushed out to meet him, snapping a salute, ready to deliver the standard briefing. General Madson, an unexpected honor, sir. We weren't aware of your visit. Madson returned the salute with a perfunctory flick of his wrist, his eyes not on Thorne but scanning the base. He was a man looking for something specific. I'm not here for a dog and pony show, Marcus, the general said. his voice a low gravel. His gaze swept past the assembled officers, past the formation of saluting soldiers, and landed on a lone figure overseeing the unloading of fresh medical supplies from a truck. Master Sergeant Alara Vance. Ignoring Thorne completely, General Madson walked directly toward her. A hush fell over the entire area. Soldiers stopped what they were doing. The engine of a nearby Humvee was cut. The only sound was the crunch of the general's boots on the gravel. He stopped directly in front of Alara. She turned, her expression as calm and neutral as ever, and rendered a crisp salute. Madson didn't immediately return it. His eyes, sharp and knowing, dropped from her face down to her boots. He stared at them for a long moment, his gaze resting on the worn toes, the frayed stitching, and the dark, indelible stain on the right ankle. A flicker of profound sadness, of shared history and immense respect, crossed his weathered face. "I heard they sent you to inventory, Vance," Madson said, his voice low, meant only for her but carrying across the silent yard. "A job needs doing, General," she replied, her voice even. Madson's eyes met hers again. Then, slowly, with deliberate precision, he raised his hand to the brim of his patrol cap. It wasn't the perfunctory gesture he had given Thorne. It was a slow, deeply respectful salute. The salute of one warrior acknowledging another, a gesture that transcended rank and time. "It was my honor to serve with you, Wraith," he said, the code name spoken with a quiet finality. The word hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Colonel Thorne's face went pale, a mask of pure, unadulterated shock and dawning, horrified comprehension. The two privates who had laughed on her first day stared at the ground, their faces burning with shame. Every soldier on that base stood a little straighter, their own salutes a little sharper. In that single, silent moment, the laughter was not just silenced. It was annihilated, replaced by a reverence so complete it was tangible. The general held his salute for a long moment before dropping his hand. He gave Alara a final, brief nod, turned, and walked back to his helicopter without another word to anyone. That evening, the buzz on the base was a low hum of myth and speculation. The story of the general's salute had already become legend, but Alara was not part of it. She was separate from the noise, as she always was. She sat alone on a stack of ammo crates behind the logistics containers, a single, bare bulb overhead casting a pool of lonely light. In her hands, she held her boots and a simple cleaning kit. She worked methodically, her hands moving with the same sureness they displayed on a rifle or a wiring panel. She used a stiff brush to work the day's dust from the creases and seams. She took a soft cloth and worked saddle soap into the tired, thirsty leather, restoring a bit of its suppleness. Her movements were a ritual, a form of meditation. She worked her way around each boot, her touch gentle, almost tender. When she reached the dark stain on the right one, her fingers paused. She didn't try to scrub it. She knew it was useless. The blood had become part of the leather, a molecular bond forged in desperation and grief. It was a testament to a promise kept, to the weight of a fallen friend carried for 3 days and 2 nights. The stain was not a mark of shame, but a memorial. Her fingers traced its outline, and for a fleeting moment, the impassive mask slipped, her eyes holding a deep, ancient sorrow. A figure appeared at the edge of the light. It was Corporal Tanaka. He stood there awkwardly for a moment, holding 2 steaming mugs. He didn't say the word wraith, he didn't mention the general or the firefight. He understood on an instinctual level that such things were too loud for this quiet space. He simply stepped forward and held out one of the mugs. "Thought you might want this, Master Sergeant," he said softly. Alara looked up, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Thank you, Corporal." She took the mug, its warmth seeping into her cold fingers. Tanaka gave a small, respectful nod and retreated back into the darkness, leaving her alone with her thoughts and her duty. The final image of FOB Kestrel that night was not of a hero or a legend, but of a woman sitting in the quiet light, carefully tending to her old boots. They were not a symbol of neglect. They were a ledger of her life, written in scuffs and scars and blood. The laughter was gone forever, replaced by a profound, respectful silence that was worth more than any medal. Her dignity, like the stain, remained,